Hello again, and today we're going to be discussing the possibility of an imminent global systemic collapse. This is an issue that you've studied very carefully, and you have a number of very developed and well-researched and well-grounded views about. So I'm curious, just to start things off, where you'd like to begin.
I think there are a number of ways of looking at this. I think the first thing to note is that in 2008, with the global financial crisis, we had we came very close to an outright financial and economic collapse. I think we previously discussed, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, I think, of Lehman Brothers, the United States Congress met in secret for the only second time in its history. And the belief was that representatives of Wall Street, of the American financial industry, spoke candidly to political representatives about the likely systemic collapse the American banking industry was facing as a result of this collapse of Lehman Brothers. As you probably recall, in the initial aftermath of the breakdown of Bear Stearns and I think it was Lehman, there had been a response advocated by people in US politics, which was that as per a capitalist creative destruction, these banks should be allowed fail. The point being that if other large scale businesses suffered such losses and went out of business, there would be no expectation of salvation from the public purse. But the warnings were given that if banks were allowed to collapse, if insolvent banks were allowed to collapse, it would lead to a freeze in interbank financing, which would lead very, very quickly to bank runs. So the fear was that within a matter of days, it would lead to the breakdown of the American financial system. That this would then mean is that there would be runs on banks where people are trying to take their money from banks that they feared would be insolvent, and then the entire financial economic system would implode. The real danger arises from the fact that the banking system is in no small part dependent on confidence. It is, in a way, a confidence trick. The assets banks claim to hold and their balance sheets are leveraged via a fiat system and through their reserve banking system is that they only have a small percentage of actual assets to secure their liabilities they would hold on their balance sheet. If confidence in a bank is lost, the bank will quickly collapse. So when we look at today's economic system, it's worth remembering what happened in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, of 10 years ago. Governments, including the US government, but also governments throughout the developed world, acted very quickly to secure the balance sheets of threatened banks. Huge amounts of public monies were secured to save the financial industry. The wisdom of that, in retrospect, is neither here nor there, but it's worth recognizing that in the event of a similar crisis in the financial industry, governments, whether in the US or in other parts of the developed world, will be much less able to effect rescue, specifically because the level of national indebtedness in the United States and throughout the developed world is much greater than it was. Also, the policy remedy of lowering interest rates to approximately zero as a way of stimulating the economy will not be able to can't be repeated. So governments throughout the developed world will enter the next crisis without the two primary policy weapons which were used with good effect in 2008. So it's the scenario, the lurid scenario, which was outlined in secret to the US Congress in the aftermath of the GFC, could play itself out.
I think that's a very fair point. And for those of us who would like to imagine that there isn't the possibility of an imminent collapse in the future, it's very much as you said, the conditions still exist. And the means of dealing with such a collapse, again, simply aren't there.
No, no, and I think it's worth considering the views of a number of experts here, particularly those who look at the national books. Recently, David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, who in his effect the chief accountant of the United States, retired from his position with the view of alerting or attempting to alert the American people as to the inordinate danger posed by the rising indebtedness of the United States. That in itself simply can't continue. This reinforces the view reflected by Congressman X in his recent expose, where he states and informs the reader that it is widely known inside U.S. government that the U.S. its level of indebtedness it simply cannot continue to borrow at the levels that it's done so. And this, as I said, points to the fact that in the event of a repeat of the scenario, such as we found with the GFC, the US government will be much less able to manage that blow. The reason we can expect a replay of something like the global financial crisis is that, as you know, we haven't stepped outside our own history. The end of history was declared 20 odd years ago. The end of ideological struggle was announced. But the great events of history in forms of wars and terrorism, even environmental events such as earthquakes and the like, all of these could easily cause a radical downturn. And in the context of the intense fragility of the financial system, we could see a reprise of the GFC, and then a scenario where governments are unable to prevent widespread systemic losses inside the economy, which will then have, as a result, large scale effects on the rest of the economy in terms of employment and productivity.
So, what do you see as the most likely event that would catalyze another global crisis?
I think that if we look at the presidency of Donald Trump, he has two great foreign policy crisis on his hands. One is with North Korea, and the second is with Iran. Commentary today, of course, is generally in the mass media is generally very unsympathetic to Donald Trump, very unsympathetic to his foreign policy efforts. But I think a better observation would be is that Donald Trump is simply trying to do what the structural problems inherited from previous administrations, and these are problems which are almost the the default product of the international system as it's currently constructed, where you have one relatively small country, i.e., the United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, and our allies are able to dominate the world to their material benefit. As such, challenge is inevitable. Challenge to that status quo is to be expected. So that challenge is arising in the form of these state actors such as Iran and North Korea, who, as we know, are heavily supported by Russia and China. In a way, America's contest with Iran and North Korea is a contest with Russia and China by proxy. The Obama administration, when we look at North Korea and Iran, succeeded in kicking the can down the road. The Iranian regime, with its radical elements, remains in place. It remains a determined enemy of American hegemony in the Middle East, and of course, a determined enemy of Israel. Likewise, with North Korea, North Korean regime has been is mounts a sustained challenge to the United States. It has learned the lesson that nuclear disarmament It's learned a lesson from the Libyan case that nuclear disarmament may lead to violent overthrow of their government. And so Donald Trump comes into power and he has to face the likes of both Iran and North Korea. Now, unfortunately for him, he cannot successfully continue the policies of his predecessors, which was to be essentially inactive in the face of both these problems. With Iran's power is growing uh, throughout the Middle East, as is known, and it has continued in its way with its nuclear weapons program. North Korea continues to develop, has already developed nuclear weapons and is now developing the means with which to directly strike the United States. Now, the reason why the American government cannot let these two problems continue unresolved is that ultimately North Korea and or Iran will secure themselves by selling these systems, by proliferating these weapons. So from a North Korean perspective, say, their security would be best served by ensuring Muslim states in the Middle East acquire similar weapons. Because for the United States, the Middle East is a far greater priority than is North Korea. All that said, we can expect military action from the United States against the likes of Iran or North Korea because it is almost systemically or structurally guaranteed. In the event, though, of such a war, it would, according to all experts, these wars would be of far greater scale than of anything seen, at least since the first Gulf War in 1991. Both Iran and North Korea possess the means to cause great harm to, if not America itself, her allies, such as the North Koreans can strike at Japan, the Iranians can strike at oil supplies and oil production in the Gulf. And in either scenario, you can imagine there would be enormous costs associated with wars there. There would also be shocks to the financial system, which will magnify themselves because of the result of social media. And you could see real downturns on the stock exchanges, on stock markets. Of course, big financial institutions are very much sensitive to changes there. And again, you could easily see some movements, negative movements in the derivative market, say, pulling down some banks. So we can easily see a reprise of the GFC happening as a result of a war, which seems to be possibly structurally guaranteed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to just zoom out into even more of a long-term picture, the fact of the matter is that all of this is happening against the backdrop of environmental disintegration. So even if these particular potential crises are navigated with tremendous skill and somehow we're able to avert the consequences that appear to be looming on the horizon, the fact remains that you can't continue to have economic stability in a planet where the ecosystem itself is undergoing such rapid disintegration.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. When we look at social systems, what we can analysts tend to confuse abstractions with reality itself. A financial system is ultimately just a series of abstractions. It can be creatively re-engineered or managed in any number of ways, whereby the sort of scenario I outlined could be evolved in terms of whether there would be is a war structurally guaranteed? Yes, it would seem so. But in terms of, if human history teaches you anything, it is to expect unexpected. As has been noted, there are very, very few geopolitical predictions that are ever borne out. Very few people ever get it right. But in terms of what is happening with the environment, we're dealing with something there which is much more observable, much less contestable, and far more threatening. And the problem with the environment, on one hand, is it's being generated by an ever increasing world population, but it's also the degradation of the environment and the resource exhaustion is are themselves the product of our economic system.
Sure. What do you think of the odds that, let's just say, the powers that be could attempt to manufacture a certain type of limited crisis that they perceive themselves as being able to control in order to manipulate the global economic system in their favor?
Well, this is the old. It's an old view of communists. The old communist analysis of fascism, that it was noted that the contradictions of capitalism would invariably produce severe economic and social disruption, and that disruption is cynically managed by a certain form of nationalist and militaristic politics. So this view, incidentally, still informs the political thinking of the Russian leadership. It explains their intense hostility to NATO expansion up to the border. They have the view that invariably Western capitalism will enter some sort of crisis, leading to large-scale loss of wealth via financial collapse and or mass unemployment. In that sort of event, in some sort of systemic crisis, politics were becoming increasingly nationalistic and xenophobic and militaristic. And so one could well imagine, even for the current American administration, that if it were to face a GFC or some great financial crisis and an associated economic crisis, much broader economic crisis, that they would seek some sort of conflict to distract the population and also to justify measures which support the status quo. Just to give you a specific example, during the financial crisis in Europe, there were a number of bank bail-ins where the banks were allowed to seize the assets of customers with a view to saving themselves from certain loss and collapse. This, though, is intensely controversial and likely to generate widespread public anger. But it's the sort of maneuver you can imagine a government could advocate, claiming extraordinary national crisis, such as a large scale war in the Middle East or in the Korean Peninsula or something. Um, Bank bail-ins could be executed all as some policy of um, war management.
Sure. And let's not forget the possibility that something could happen in the UFO arena. Specifically, Stephen Greer has long maintained that there is an agenda to present the extraterrestrial presence as being hostile so as to justify an intense military buildup of some kind, possibly even something resembling a global police state. And what I have in mind specifically here is the way in which war and military spending can be a stimulus to the economy and so on. And perhaps faced with the imminent possibility of a global financial crisis, it could spur certain elements to accelerate this sort of plan toward perhaps a UFO based false flag event or just a controlled disclosure event in which these visitors are presented as being a threat to humanity so as to shore things up on a conventional terrestrial front.
Yeah, that scenario Greer outlines is plausible in its own terms. The structural weaknesses of the global system are well known to the powers that be. These issues with population and indebtedness, of crisis and conflict between competing powers, it's known and understood. And at the heart of it, ultimately, you could say, is the problem of overpopulation. So, for those who constitute the intelligence and the thinking part of our global government, they have a problem that requires some sort of solution. Now, Greer does highlight the fact that the worldview of many of these people in the global government are fairly noxious, vicious, fascistic. And so we could expect some very harsh actions from them. I think the war provides a wonderful cover for all sorts of actions. You could even imagine something like, um, in one scenario, I came across that there would be a limited nuclear war, which would serve as the cover for establishing authoritarian government throughout the West. This authoritarian government would be imposed on a supposedly temporary short-term basis, which of course would become permanent. But with the populations subject to authoritarian control, various viruses could be released, various bioweapons could be released, which could affect a population reduction, thereby securing the structural foundation of elite control.
Yeah, something this brings to mind for me is the fact that, you know, over the past couple of years, terms such as deep state and false flag have been entering a bit more into mainstream discourse, and they're being pretty offhandedly repudiated and sort of shoved under the rug again by people in the mainstream media. I think, though, that it represents a drift toward a point in the development of the system where its real functions are becoming harder and harder to conceal.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And I think even Trump's election sort of represents a popular recognition that there are systemic forces arrayed against them. I think, many people, if many of those who voted for Trump have questioned closely, would more than willingly accept the point that Trump is unfit for office in very obvious ways, that he is a buffoonish character, that he is something of a clown. But he does represent an effort to stall systemic function. In a way, it's like he provides the satisfaction of throwing a brick through the window of a bank. The bank will still open the next day, but people do receive the pleasure of having put the brick through the window.
Yeah, certainly. And I've always felt that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both represent effectively two varied responses to the same overall crisis of confidence. It's remarkable, if you go back 10, 20 years, uh, and you ask the average person on the street, do you feel like the mainstream media is lying to you? Do you feel like there is a comprehensive program of deceit going on that extends throughout all levels of society? I think a lot fewer people would sign on to a proposition like that. But since I guess you could say the two turning points are the global financial crisis that you mentioned and September 11th, since those two events, and I guess you could also argue since the proliferation of social media, which along with all of its problems, its social and cultural problems, it also brings in the possibility of distributed non-mainstream news sources. Of course, there's also a bubble that has been commented on a lot, by which I mean People kind of wind up being enclosed both through their own choices and through the result of algorithms within a bubble that reflects their own ideological presuppositions. Nevertheless, social media has allowed people to distribute alternative views. And all this being taken together, people don't see any hope in going about things the way they've gone about it before. And so they're looking elsewhere.
Well, yeah, well, there's two things in what you've said there that I just like to respond to. The first is the role of social media. In recent weeks, the World Cup has been played out, and of some interest has been the progress of the English football team. They managed to find themselves in the semi-final, which was a most unlikely outcome. They're a poor team objectively. They are objectively speaking. They're ranked. They have quite a low ranking. They managed to secure a few hard-won victories over teams ranked even lower than them. So objectively analyzed, you could look at that team and say it is very little prospect or very little chance of going out and actually winning the World Cup. Nonetheless, the English media succeeded in creating an enormous level of expectation in the English population at large that victory in the World Cup was possible. Now, this was noted how you have this extraordinary cognitive dissonance created over seemingly trivial matter. And the point was made by one media analyst is that with the role of social media, there is a radical amplification of people's social consciousness in a way that simply wasn't possible in another age. With the proliferation of smartphones at any time of the day or in any place, people are able to tap into the group mind. And the English group mind, of course, is reacting in a very visceral way to the occasion of the World Cup. Now, the relevance for that here, when we look at the issue of economic crisis and collapse, is that in the event of a war or an earthquake in Tokyo or San Francisco or something like this, social media will magnify the expected effects. I can easily imagine an atmosphere or a sense of fear or doom taking a great grip on the population, and the relevance of that for economic behavior is obvious in that both consumption and investment are in large part determined by people's expectations of the future. If that population all of a sudden becomes quite fearful and fearful in a perhaps in an exaggerated way, then that can impinge on consumption and investment in such a way as to manifest those fears. So the fear in a way becomes self-fulfilling. The second thing I'd like to pick up on there is this issue of legitimacy. The legitimacy of the American government, of course, as you say, it suffered enormously from the event of 9/11. Many people at the time recall how the story was initially presented. There were certain elements of it that didn't make any sense. There's the footage of reporters speaking about collapsed buildings which are standing in the background. There is the collapse of the building 9, which was untouched by the airplanes. You have the collapse of the towers, approximately free fall speed. You had thermite recovered from the rubble, and on and on and on. And there's just sufficient questions there as to make possible in the minds of many that there was a conspiracy to bring those buildings down. I think much more damaging, though, to state legitimacy and the legitimacy of the political system was the GFC and how governments responded by taking on enormous amounts of debt in order to secure the banks. Populations across the Western world found that their national debt levels increased radically through no fault of their own. So the average citizen in places, whether it's in Southern Europe or Italy or even the United States, would see that their country had become much more indebted through no fault of their own. And moreover, people would have noted that the public weal or the commonwealth of their countries was able to respond very rapidly and decisively to the needs of those societies' wealthiest people. As many people know that if you were running a small business in any of these countries and you went to the wall and you lost your livelihood and your home, the government wasn't going to bail you out. But what people witnessed, and again, it was the popular interpretation, is that the very richest people were saved. The likes of Goldman Sachs benefited enormously. Bonuses were still paid, and on and on and on. I think at that point, the legitimacy of Western states was very sorely undermined. And I think then on the issue of legitimacy, there's one other thing to take into account. Rightly or wrongly, the large scale migration of third world peoples into the developed countries is undermining popular state legitimacy. Again, rightly or wrongly, whatever the merits of it may be, it's uncontroversial to say that such movement of people is unpopular with native peoples, and they tend to find that this is occurring without much consultation.
What do you foresee would be the short and long term consequences of the type of collapse that we're talking about?
Well, if we try and pull a few of these threads together, that if there were a repeat of the GFC sparked by any number of events or developments that have occurred in our past, such as wars or even earthquakes in major centers or an act of terrorism or something like this, there's a repeat of something like the financial crisis. And if Western governments are unable to contain the financial collapse, which is a reasonable expectation, and banks go down and inflicts large scale losses on the economy as a whole, and this leads to an increase in unemployment. Now, this isn't fantastical stuff. This sort of scenario has played itself out on a local scale in many economies in the developed world since the end of the Cold War. Now, if that sort of situation plays out, where Western governments are dealing with a decline in production, a decline in levels of employment, they're dealing with increasing unemployment, increasing demands on the budget for welfare and the like. And this is occurring in the context of loss of legitimacy. Then what you could expect, what you must expect rather, is that there will be those groups will emerge who will seek to secede from the political order as constituted in developed countries. So currently, you see in the United States, throughout Europe, you notice that the political debate is becoming ever more aggressive, simpler, and divided. So you have talk of civil war in places such as Germany and the United States, where there was, I think, an opinion poll recently published in the US where I think as many as a third of Americans expected a civil war in that country. Equally in Germany, there have been similar reports and similar claims. Now, what makes analysis of the current political instability in Europe and America interesting is the fact that this instability is occurring at a time of unprecedented and unequaled economic prosperity. Brexit and the Catalonian independence vote, for example, the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, for example, and on and on and on. This is happening not in the context of an economic crisis. This is occurring in contexts where there is very high levels of employment, very high levels of economic production, ongoing growth, where government budgets are fundamentally not that distressed. So I think it's very interesting to consider what would happen if the economic situation turns around, as it tends to cyclically anyway, where it gives rise to a far higher level of social distress, which will then have the predictable political consequences.
Yeah, and this time the consequences are liable to be very dire. As I've been reflecting on this lately, an analogy that has come to mind is something from physics, namely the idea of a false vacuum and the idea of a system being metastable. This is something I heard about in the context of the Higgs field, namely that a system can be in a state where there's a local minimum of energy, but not a global minimum of energy. And what can happen then is it can appear to be in a maximally stable state, and a very small perturbation could lead to the whole thing effectively falling in on itself. Now, from a certain point of view, the entirety of human economic history, maybe even since agriculture, is a kind of metastable system. Because if you look at the condition of other living organisms in the animal kingdom, there is a perpetual striving to survive against environmental conditions which seek an equilibrium where no species gains such an enormous advantage against the rest of the environment, like the advantage that human beings currently enjoy. And the thought occurred to me that perhaps the reason why economic collapse and social disruption are so perpetual is because what we take to be the default condition of society is actually really far away from a real vacuum, by analogy, or a real minimum state of energy, uh, which, philosophically you could call the state of nature. And any possible social or economic configuration that we could ever contrive is always going to be a false vacuum of sorts, and is always going to be subject to falling back into the state of nature.
There you're inviting consideration of of what economic activity has looked like over the long run of history. In from that view, our current arrangements are very much an aberration over what has occurred previously, where much economic activity, if not most economic activity, was local in nature, locally oriented, and satisfying local needs. So to use, to rely on, metaphors from the sciences. What we saw previously in for the global economy, it was a much more complex ecosystem with any number of particular evolutionary niches separated from another, and that had its qualities associated with that. But now what we see is, in effect, a simple ecological monoculture in a way. I suppose an analogy would be say the great flattening out of the forests of Australia to create huge industrial the farms of industrial agricultural scale. Now the quality of such a system relevant here is the fact that it then becomes extraordinarily fragile as the number of elements, constituent elements decline, those elements then increase in relative importance. So, whereas in other time, to be specific, a financial crisis in either in the likes of New York or London could be localized and contained. Nowadays, in our present context, such a crisis will have enormous systemic effects, essentially because of simplification of the system, the reduction of the critical elements, and of course, um, the increase in dependence of these variables upon each other.
Sure. What measures do you feel like people should be taking as individuals to prepare for the possibility of a global financial crisis and the attendant social instability?
Well, I suppose the first thing you do well to remember is that it's unlikely anyone will be able to successfully anticipate exactly how things will unfold. I think at a minimum, if there is a financial crisis and an economic downturn, one could expect is that unemployment will increase, as will taxation. There'll be decline in government expenditure. So the quality of social services you enjoy will fall. You'll probably be poorer that is, even if you don't lose your job or your business. So the first thing somebody would do well to consider is what forms of employment or remuneration are, uh, if not recession proof, or more secure in recession than other jobs, for example. So any sort of employment or business that is oriented to meeting human needs is likely to fare better than any form of employment or business which is oriented towards luxury consumption, for example. So that's, I suppose, the first thing anyone should take into account is just look at how they're making the money in a very conventional sense. I think thereafter, if you start to look at the questions of legitimacy and social order, every society will respond in different ways, and I don't think you can predict ahead of time exactly how the social contract will unravel. I think you probably people would do well maybe to move away from the bigger cities because you could. It's fair to assume that what social difficulties will arise will be concentrated there. But even having said that, you can't anticipate that country living would be a superior option because you can easily imagine that governments will concentrate their resources on where wealth is concentrated, and that tends to be in the cities. So it's hard to anticipate and it's hard to say, but just at a minimum, eliminate people will do well to eliminate debt if they can. Um, Eliminate speculative investments if they can, but ensure that there is a form of employment that they could expect that it would be sustained. Cynically, you'd have to say is that government employment is probably the best option there. The governments, as per political theory, will retain a monopoly on violence, and you can expect that the states will be able to sustain themselves, come what may.
I wonder if there's a sense in which such a collapse could be a good thing in the long term, even the very long term perspective of humanity. I mean, because in a sense, we've entered into the experiment of civilization to such an extent. And then compounded upon that, we've entered so deeply into various ideologically constrained subjective universes to such an extent. And, we're if despoiling the environment so rapidly that perhaps from a macro historical point of view, uh, a global collapse could be good for the furtherance of humanity.
Oh, I think so. I think there's an awful lot to be said for that point of view. If you even look at our current social context, if trend we see a trend of ever decreasing freedom, of an increase in totalitarian control, which has been exerted by both the public and the private sphere. Now, this trend we can expect to continue in any event. One can easily imagine that in the event of a financial and economic crisis, that totalitarian control will become even more severe. In the event of um, challenge to state legitimacy by various groups, we can imagine a totalitarian reaction. And all told, humanity is becoming less free. And without freedom, uh, choice becomes far more circumscribed, which ultimately means that spiritual growth and development becomes less possible.
Yeah, I think you could say, at the risk of really dangerous oversimplification, that the whole balance of society kind of rests on the trading of freedom for security. And if you go back to the beginnings of recorded history, you could say that we've traded a certain amount of tangible human freedom that we enjoyed as hunter gatherers for, let's say, agriculture. And, the thing about this is that from a biological point of view, human beings haven't really changed at all from the time they were hunter gatherers, meaning that their drives, their inclinations, the sorts of things that make them happy tend to correspond with the life of a pre-agricultural state. People like to wander. People like to see a different environment every day. They like to spend a lot of time outside. And we're chemically, emotionally calibrated for those sorts of things. However, the security offered by having a surplus of goods to live off of was sufficient enticement to get us away from that, however much we might be inclined. Now, I'm not arguing for anything for, anarcho primitivism or anything like that. I'm not saying that agriculture is a bad thing. I'm just using it as a macro historical case in point for how, at the very outset, there's a trade of freedom for security. And the whole way down the line in the development of human society, you see the same dynamic in play. A recent example, of course, a very obvious one, is what happened in the wake of 9/11. People traded a certain amount of freedom for perceived security. And, it's a very dangerous trade because the more embedded we become in systems that offer us the perception of having, material prosperity, the less most of us tend to actualize our conscious potentialities, and the more we sort of adapt to becoming creatures which are part of a larger machine. And you even see biological evidence of this. For a very long time, apparently, the size of the human brain has actually been shrinking, not getting larger. And scientists aren't sure why. But one theory is that this is the same thing we see in domesticated animals. Over the course of the time that an animal species is domesticated, you see the same thing. Their brains gradually get smaller. So perhaps there's a very crucial sense in which we have domesticated ourselves, and we're undermining ourselves in a really dangerous, fundamental, and yet subtle and almost invisible way.
It's it's a very interesting question to ponder. What is actually happening, say, to human intelligence, which is, of course, a little more narrow than what you've been speaking about. But if we look at just to give one data point that leaps to mind, is that within the UFO literature, you find there's a claim from Billy Meyer where he reports that he's been told is that human intelligence is in rapid decline. He's even gone so far as to produce sort of statistical information to support this point, but it is radical and pronounced by his claim. And that claim is, by definition, extraordinary given its supposed origin. Less extraordinary the claims that came from a British academic study 2 years ago, I believe it was, which argued that the British intelligence, the average intelligence, has been declining by 1 point a decade for 150 years, I believe, or 120 or 150 years. Now, they calculated this by using some reaction times as a proxy. Now, the actual details of the study I can't report, but it's an arresting claim to say that average IQ has gone from 115 or 120 in the middle of the 19th century to 100 today. Now, what that will do for the warp and weave of society, what it looks like, and how it functions, really don't need to explain here. But that sort of claim also speaks to an idea advanced by another set of psychologists studying Human Intelligence, where they argued that the intelligence of some of the the average citizen of ancient Greece, I believe, was somewhere between 140 and 150. Now, whatever the truth of that claim, what is significant here is that that claim is even being advanced by such academics. For example, the idea is that human intelligence is in some sort of severe and sharp decline. Um, Whether that's the case, well, we don't quite know. There are arguments for and against radical declines, radical increases, or even more moderate increases and decreases. What we can see, what is indisputable, is that given the development of information technologies, is that more and more people are able to deny the reality principle via the ubiquity of phones and computers and screens. Humans are increasingly divorced and separated from their physical environment. The overall impact of that in terms of civilizational function, of course, are very hard to determine. But I think one interesting fact is this: the presidential election in the year 2000 was dominated by the issue of global warming, which is, of course, it is about the damage physical activity is doing to the physical environment. And I think this is something all people could see, sense, and had some intimation of. Whereas you find today, 2016 or 2018 rather, the American administration has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement with very little backlash or very little concern from the public. Um, and again, it's not something isolated to the United States. You find in Germany, they've recently discovered that the German car industry and government had acted as a cartel to corrupt and damage the efforts of the European Union to reduce diesel emissions. Now, I suppose in one way, the link between that and social media, the link between that and people having a poor ability to locate themselves in time and space is unclear. But at a minimum, I think it's fair to say that that inability of people to locate themselves in time and space is an evolutionary regression, certainly not a progression.
Yeah, it's almost as if, in a way, the way that we've structured society is about outsourcing our intelligence. Outsourcing, because they say that a prehistoric human being, if you were to compare them physiologically to a human being who's part of civilization, everyone who existed in a prehistoric context basically had the level of health of what we would now consider to be a professional athlete, because that's just what was needed to survive. Uh, and you could speculate maybe that other capacities also were similarly more robust, whereas now we sort of fit ourselves into the groove of our cubicle, and we perform an extremely narrow and specialized function. And mentally, we fit ourselves into the groove of the television set, and to an increasing extent to social media. And I could it's astounding to imagine that anyone could claim that the average human intelligence was once so much higher. I hadn't heard about what you were saying about ancient Greece, for example, but that's really crazy to think about. When I think about all this, trying to take in the big picture, two figures that come to mind are Friedrich Nietzsche and Terence McKenna. And there's something fundamental that the two of them seem to agree about, even though they're pretty different in the overall shape of their projects and the direction of their concern. And it's this: Nietzsche said that man is a rope tied over an abyss, a rope between the animal world, what he called the ape, and a world beyond the human condition as we presently know it, which he saw as being embodied in the Overman. And Terence McKenna describes something very similar, but he's talking about this dynamic in the context of entering the life of the universe. And he says that the period of time that human beings are embedded in what we call history is a lot like when a caterpillar is inside of a chrysalis. So during that period of time, it's extremely vulnerable. Anything can come along and destroy it. A gust of wind could blow it off of a tree. But when it emerges, it's free to soar, and it's not, a caterpillar can just be eaten off of a branch by any passing bird. A butterfly is free to move about. It has a lot more degrees of freedom. Now, in a sense, McKenna speculates that the human species could be an effort on the part of the life of the Earth to enter the universe. Because if the planetary ecosystem has any kind of intelligence or awareness, it may be aware that extinction events have a certain they recur, and there have been many of them in the course of the history of life on this planet, and perhaps what we're doing is, by entering so deeply into our advanced economy and to the technology that makes it possible and the technology to which it gives rise, is we're trying to get off of this planet. And really, what's really happening is there's a tightrope walk where either all the forces we've mobilized in the form of civilization will either allow us to enter the life of the universe by allowing us to develop the sort of technology which would get us off the planet, or will be undone by the effort, like a miscarried child. And the socioeconomic and technological forces that we've marshaled will crush us because we haven't managed to get through this in the most conscious way possible, or just because you know the contingencies of chance were too great, and we were washed away in the ebb of time.
Yeah, it's if you look at we're talking about what we're trying to consider here is the life cycle of human civilization, and what we're suggesting is that we're trying to identify whether there is a moment of great crisis imminent. And we see that in the life cycle of the human being is that in the development of its consciousness, it's punctuated by crisis and trauma, and that these ratcheting up of environmental pressure, um, it's necessary to the growth of that consciousness. It's often said, people look at the challenges of their life and they understand that it served their development in very real ways. Equally, we could see that if we are approaching some great crisis, some great trauma, it may be necessary for the growth of our civilization's consciousness. You mentioned Greer earlier on, and one image he was shown of a possibility for the human race is that our planet would be impacted by not once but twice by asteroids or comets. The first asteroid effectively ends industrial civilization. The second then is a radical, a killer blow, and he's then shown that the only, I think, surviving remnant was somewhere in northern Scandinavia. Now you might look at something like this and try and try and take that great macro historical view. You could easily imagine a situation where you would have a tiny nucleus of the human race would survive. That outcome would in fact be one deeply desired by humanity as a whole. If we look at the life cycle of of human civilization, is something that we will all participate in via the mechanism of reincarnation, then we may think, well, if there is a conscious planning for the human race as a whole, we may think that we would do well to depopulate the planet, have a small group then has to make its way through an extremely challenging environmental situation. This will give rise to a society which is functionally far superior than anything that has existed so far in this world. And then that society would be far more attractive for the living of the sort of lives people deeply desire.
Yeah, it's possible, certainly. And, you know, because, sometimes I wonder whether or not the reason there are so many human beings present is because, assuming, presupposing that reincarnation is a real thing and that at any given time, there are actually, let's say, more threads of human consciousness that are currently embodied. uh, it's possible that the reason why we have such a large population right now is that there is in the name of more distributed parallel processing, because the more people are alive, the more processes of computation are running simultaneously. So, in order to work on the problems of survival on the one hand and what you might call ascension on the other, temporarily having more people focused into the physical allows us to sort of work out some of the deep cultural, historical questions about the nature of our existence, or possibly to develop the technology to expand off the planet. And in a sense, the prevailing social innovations that exist right now, on one hand, science, and on the other hand, capitalism, and on the other hand, democracy, those three of those things have something in common, which is that they're distributed processing systems. Science distributes intelligence so that human beings can work on a problem piecemeal here and there and everywhere. Democracy aspires to be the same, even though in practice, most of the actually existing democracies are really oligarchies. And capitalism, distributes decision making, even though in practice, it's really a kind of top-down imperialistic structure most of the time. In essence, so in the abstract, all of the most successful institutions, science, democracy, and global capitalism, are about distributing intelligence. And maybe this is a brief period before which the contradictions in capitalism, i.e., it being pitted against the environment and the social tensions, and bring about the kind of collapse we're talking about. Maybe there's a brief window during which all of this distributed parallel processing can allow a kind of complexification, and after which, if there is a simplified global situation like the one you're talking about, or a scenario in which we enter the life of the universe and get off the surface of the planet, things could be simpler systemically, but the people who exist in that time could be the inheritors of everything that was worked out and understood in that more complex distributed period.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I suppose the first thing that came to mind as you were speaking is that we see in the natural world often a level of fecundity which is which is extraordinary to the actual outcome. For example, millions of sperm, but only one will actually fertilize the egg. Um, Seeds from many flowers and plants, thousands of such, maybe only one or two will actually become another plant. So what immediately comes to mind is that there are billions of people, only a certain few thousand or million will actually proceed onwards um, over the medium to long term. In terms of the actual simplification and complexity of social function, I've often reflected upon why you could expect some survival in Scandinavia, say. Like why there? Like why not South Korea or Philippines, wherever? Take a pick. Now it could be just pure um, chance, historical chance that there's an outcome there that's just contingent on blind luck and randomness. But it may well be is that going forward, what will be required of individuals is a far higher level of social function. So, Scandinavian societies are famous for the elaboration of their social contract, the very well developed and extensive welfare states that enjoy widespread and deep support within their population. And this requires, I think, that demands rather a certain complexity in their interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships, and that may be the evolutionary requirement of this moment. So, to speak alongside what you said is, with this enormous increase in population, it could well be nature's way of conducting as many such experiments as possible, with a view of finding that which is sufficiently evolutionarily potentiated as to survive.
Yeah, that could well be. I mean, of course, we're talking about a conception of nature that's, different than the anti-teleological sort of reductive materialist Darwinism that is the sort of mainstream default. We're talking about a conception of nature in which, the planetary ecosystem and possibly some kind of diffuse gestalt of consciousness throughout the universe is not only animate but sentient. But that's something that I sign on to. It seems plausible to me, and yeah, I mean, it could very well be that there's an experiment underway, and let's hope that in the vagaries and contingencies of how that experiment plays out, that humanity will be able to integrate what it's learned in the process of history, and that it will continue to go on into bigger and better things.
Well, yeah, and just again to return to a question you asked earlier on about what would be the best best response possible for people in the event of such a crisis. My first answer involved suggestions how as to how people can ensure their material well-being, what forms of employment and business to pursue, to be alive to which sectors of the economy can be are likely to sustain themselves in any event. A second answer would have to involve how people relate to their own environment through their own conscious choices. And I think critical for survival through what lies ahead, distance is from the group mind. In other words, we have much talk from survivalists and the like about going off grid physically and economically. They hold the idea of the homestead in the remote wilds, your own power, your own food, water, and the like. Um, but I think what is more important is for people to be able to go mentally off grid, that they disentangle themselves from the means of group mind, reproduction, and self-reflection via social media. I think that in the event of crisis, social fear, disorientation, and irrationality will grow greatly. Um, and that will impede intelligent decision making and will prevent intelligent intuition as to best courses of action. The means to that, of course, is through the spiritual traditions which are well known to us all.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point, and it's something that you've always been very keen to emphasize anytime we've discussed what is the best thing to do to prepare for whatever might be down the road. The first and foremost thing you've always said is to focus on developing yourself spiritually. And I'm glad came to mind for you to emphasize that again. I couldn't agree more. I think that regardless of what happens, survival, even in a particular physical incarnation, is secondary compared to the extent to which you have developed your consciousness. And in the course of human maturation, as you said, from a conventional psychological standpoint, crisis is often conducive to the deepening complexity and maturity of a person. And, this whole historical crisis and the series of crises that humanity has undergone with its wars and its famines and its plagues and its upheavals, perhaps hopefully in the long run will be conducive to our awakening in a even more fundamental, pervasive, and expansive sense.
Well, there's something else that came to mind is that David Hawkins, a spiritual teacher of some note, claimed by many people to be enlightened. He was a clinical psychiatrist by training and profession. And interestingly, he was a recovering alcoholic. And he said that alcoholism and drug addiction is often chosen by people as the fastest road, fastest route to enlightenment because people will put themselves in a context where it's either enlightenment or death. They'll put themselves in a context, in a condition where the only thing that can save them is extraordinary spiritual growth. Now, the obvious point here is for the vast majority of people who embrace that road, if that's what they're doing, they fail. And so, if for humanity as a whole, if we are attempting to evolve, it may be that only a tiny minority do so.
Yeah, that's the way things, tend to happen in nature. Nietzsche said this, and it's pretty harsh in the way that he said it, but there's a certain truth to it, which is nature produces an excess of the abortive and the weak. And obviously, you see that because, a sea turtle will lay, I don't know, 20,000 baby turtles or whatever ridiculously enormous number it is, and most of them don't make it into the water. Ken Wilber puts it much more nicely when he says that systemically there tends to be greater depth, less span, meaning that the more levels of complexity there are in an individual or a society, the less of it there's going to be. For from a systems theoretic perspective, relatively straightforward reasons. There are necessarily fewer cells than molecules because cells are made of molecules, and there are necessarily fewer molecules than atoms because molecules are made of atoms. And similarly, Wilber takes a page from Aristotle in saying that the more developed a person is in consciousness, although Aristotle didn't put it in terms of consciousness, he was talking about it in terms of ethics. The more good a person's going to be, at the end of the day, it kind of means the same thing. I mean, I'm being a little interpretive with Aristotle here, but I think what he's saying is, and what Wilber is definitely saying is that the more actualized a person is in conscious awareness, the fewer of them they're going to be because the more hurdles you have to overcome, the more it's like a sea turtle. It has to get past the birds, it has to get past the predatory fish, it has to get past all kinds of different predation. And similarly, let's say in our own society, for a person to wind up developing themselves spiritually, they have to avoid getting absorbed into various cultural matrices and so on. And I think that what you're saying is very apt. It's enlightenment or death, and for those people who don't make it into a higher level of awareness or a greater degree of personal freedom, or the good thing about the spiritual cosmology is that there's always more turns around the wheel. I mean, we're not saying like it's some harsh thing where they're lost forever. It's good at every opportunity just to encourage people to continue developing yourself spiritually, because at the end of the day, that is what really matters.
Well, yeah, it is in any event. Even if we were to sit here and imagine the contrary scenario, we look at the problems with the financial system, with the economic system, the problems exist politically and geopolitically, and we could, I suppose, easily imagine solutions, or at least band-aid to sort of carry us through. You could also look at the environment, and you could say, well, environmental destruction has been continuing at pace for hundreds of years, but you know what? Life goes on. You could also point out that the environment and ecosystems show an extraordinary robustness and resilience over time, even in the case of the most excessive damage. Even if you're to pan out such a scenario, convince yourself of its truthfulness, or its accuracy, you still do come back to this question of spiritual development. That even a society which was defined by its justice and its stability and its equity and its intellectual and cultural dynamism, you'd still have this imperative of the development of consciousness. It- from that perspective, over the long haul, it may well be that humanity as a whole, it has the opportunity of then reincarnating and enjoying life in this world for centuries and millennia to come. That's a possibility. But I'm also reminded of Brian Weiss. He, of course, wrote a whole series on reincarnation. He wrote first book famous. The famous book was, I think, Many Lives, Many Masters. He said his sense, or he reported he had been told, is that humanity up until now has been like a one classroom school. He said the school now is about to break up, and there will be different classes. So the human race spiritually is about to split. And if you were to really, speculate and really reach here, there's something very interesting in accounts given in the UFO/ET literature about travels to other worlds. And I may be wrong here, but I don't think there's a single account of someone seeing historical ruins on another world. It's not as if they went to an alien city and it somehow crudely paralleled what you'd see in Europe, where you would have buildings of modern construction, buildings obviously of built a couple of hundred years ago, and even older buildings than that. You don't see that. What you find is what seems to be um, new, state of the art constructions. There does not seem to be historical ruins. The cities or urban environments they find themselves in are all extremely and obviously rational and planned and intensely functional. And I wonder is that when we look at those extraterrestrial civilizations, are we seeing the surviving offshoots of now dead extraterrestrial civilizations? In a way, is sort of a natural occurrence for an intelligent species to grow up on one planet, wreck the planet in the process of its maturation, and then a part of it moves into a clean and virginal territory upon which to bring the lessons from its old world into a new world.
I think that's very possible. Something that comes to mind is another thing that Terence McKenna said, which is that an intelligent species cannot exist bound to the surface of the planet for very long without killing itself and the planet, because that species, an intelligent species, will tend to try to remake its environment in the name of its own needs. And we've certainly done that. Here's a particularly telling fact: 90% of the biomass of all large animal species on this planet today consists in human beings and domesticated animals. Okay, that in a sense, in a snapshot, gives you a picture of just how much we're transforming the surface of the planet to suit our own needs, which of course is not good for the planet and ultimately not good for us. And we have basically, in the developed world, we have covered over a huge amount of the planetary surface with concrete just so we can get around on rubber wheels. If you take a minute to think about how crazy that actually is, you cut down trees and you cover most of the surface with concrete so you can roll around on rubber wheels and sell these non-sustainably produced commodities back and forth to each other. It's nuts. And so for that reason, it seems very believable to me that part of the life cycle of an intelligent species could be to despoil the planet and then wind up somewhere else where they live in a more sustainable fashion, or they just wind up beginning again from somewhere on their home planet. But it seems like a very believable vision to me.
Yeah, there's something else, that comes to mind when you had mentioned Wilbur. And Wilbur, he talks about the average level of development of a society, and he points out that that average level will serve as a center of gravity, which will tend to pull up people who are below it and pull down those who are slightly above it. Or let me put that in a better way. It has it is a gravity that draws people to that level. And if you look at developed societies today, what is happening with the, say, the breakdown in state legitimacy, in the breakdown of the political system, in the sort of recognition of the deep state and various conspiracies, the unhappiness with the bailout of the banks, um, on and on and on. Maybe the breakdown in average intelligence is that what is happening is that average, that center of gravity in our societies is disintegrating, and this then will have two effects. It's one is that many people will more people will populate lower levels of development than had done so previously, but equally it frees up more people to ascend to higher levels. So in a way, it's you can almost graphically see it as like the hatching of an egg.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. The hatching of an egg, or to go back to what McKenna was saying, the coming forth from the chrysalis. And yeah, and I can believe it. This society, in effect, has been a container, a kind of nutritive womb. And humanity has developed in the face of all the crises that it has faced. It's developed in the face of ice ages. It's developed in the face of pandemics. And the thing that's different about this six major extinction event is that it's not an asteroid that's coming. It's not anything like that. We're our own crisis. So if we emerge from the crisis, which is brought about by our own nature, then that could be the ultimate egg to break free from.
Yeah, and there is something else. Again, just trying looking at it from different perspectives, is that if we take the idea that if we take the idea that humanity is an evolutionary process, if we take that idea as a given, and we're to understand that that evolution is fundamentally the evolution of consciousness. And you look at what that means in a simple sense, which is to do with the mastery and development of attention, of the capacity to focus the mind, then you would expect great crisis to be a part of the life cycle of a species which is engaged in that sort of evolutionary process, because what crisis will do, however it manifests, will bring attention into greater focus. It will just force people to be more conscious. This is something, say, reported by Gurdjieff. He said that typically human beings live in a state of waking sleep. They live in a dream state, that they do not experience the state of consciousness proper to them, save moments of great crisis. So we could well see that this crisis, however it unfolds, as a material disaster, it could well be a disaster demographically and for huge numbers of people in very tragic ways. But it would also be a tremendous boon to our efforts to manage our own attention by forcing our attention to focus on particular circumstances, whatever they are, which would represent a development of consciousness and a realization of that evolutionary potential.